The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Smiling Human podcast and of Oak's Hour. My name is Oak, and I'm your host. Today's episode marks the end of Season 2, and as is the case with all Oak's Hour episodes, I will be addressing some questions that find their genesis in the synthesis of the ideas that flowed from the previous 3 episodes, those being with Justin McSweeney, Kyle Smith, and our first ever Trialogue episode with Nick Palladino-King and Nitin Garg. If you missed any of these 3 conversations, I would highly encourage you check them out after this one. So the questions I will be addressing in today's episode are as follows. 1. How do the stories that we tell ourselves, both conscious and unconscious, shape our identities, and what role does the prophilic self play in this process? 2. What practices can help us bridge the gap between the authentic self and those facsimiles that we embody in both the digital and physical spaces? Thirdly, how does the language that we use, whether it's ancient, modern, symbolic, or digitally derived, affect our capacity for individual and collective growth? And lastly, what steps can we take to align and enliven our inner narratives and external expressions so as to more fully relate with truth and meaning? With our path laid out before us, let's get to it. Question number 1. How do the stories we tell ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, shape our identities, and what role does the prophilic self play in this process? For long-time listeners, what I'm about to say will come as no surprise. We need to define some terms before we can answer this question, and these terms are conscious, unconscious, identity, and prophilic self. First up, conscious. This is the space where all contents, noticed, perceived, or known can be said to reside. The conscious psyche is comprised of all things of which we are aware. The unconscious, then, is the repository of all contents of consciousness or aspects of self that are unknown, unperceived, and those that have been repressed or rejected. It should be known that the unconscious is just as capable as the conscious mind of motivating behavior and stimulating emotional responses. Although the conscious mind contains the ego-self construct, the unconscious houses its reciprocal hidden sibling, the shadow self. As for identity, I will first start by saying what it is not. It is not exclusively the ego-self construct or the totality of one's self-conception, comprised of whatsoever one believes about themselves with varying degrees of abject reality. No. Although the ego-self might have aspects that grow from or are constructed out of experiences that relate to identity, this is an incomplete picture. It's incomplete as a result of the ego-self being an exclusively internal phenomenon, whereas identity is one that is primarily relational. The identity is a psychosocial phenomenon, and it finds its nascence and perpetuation inside the relationships of the individual in question. It's informed both by the authentic notion of the person as well as the distinct quality of the roles they occupy within said relationships. These roles are accepted or bestowed, and sometimes even sought, and can be illustrated by imagining some titles, like doctor, mother, jester, bully, confidant, baker, etc. You can see how each of these would and could both be projected onto and stepped into by an individual. If a person performs and conforms to the expectation of these roles, be they theirs or another person's expectations, then they fulfill the aspects necessary to bridge the gap between the worlds of identity and that of ego-self. Conversely, for an example, if my ego self believes that I am the city's best baker, and yet I do not bake, or my goods are subpar and rejected by the community, then baker or best baker does not form a part of my identity due to the lack of social validation. Now, lastly, let's examine the prophilic self. This particular variation of self was first introduced to me by Justin McSweeney in episode 9, and we discuss it in depth there. So if you find yourself interested in this specific element of the episode, be sure to check out that one after. The prophilic self is born out of the ego self, but rather than being a purely mental happenstance, it finds its reality through the world of social media. As the name suggests, prophilic refers to the profiles that each of us have across myriad platforms. The attached self in question is both the curated set of qualities, aspects, and behaviors that motivate how we craft these profiles, and the end target we hope to portray and be perceived as within the digital social space. Although these reductionistic and curated extensions of our personality find their roots in our living being, they are wholly external to the person and are only birthed and animated by them. They are a costume of usernames, selfies, stories, and reels whose environment is rife with the temptation to conform. With these definitions clarified, then, we might return to the question with a fresh mind. How do the stories we tell, either conscious or unconscious, shape our identities, and what role does the prophilic self play in this process? The stories told by the conscious mind differ greatly from those told by the unconscious. This is primarily because the conscious mind is very fond of the linguistic, propositional, and rational, whereas the unconscious speaks in symbol, allusion, and metaphor. Furthermore, there is no law that binds our conscious and unconscious stories into congruency. In fact, dissonance between the two narrative groupings is a very common state for most people in our modern world, and I would also add that it is a source of great suffering and disillusionment. The extent to which these conscious and unconscious narratives shape our identity was alluded to earlier. Being that identity requires social recognition and participation, then both of these narratives are impotent to shape identity at whim. They can, and most certainly will, determine those events, habits, and people to which an individual is attracted or repulsed, and thus they are capable of shaping the points of social contact alone that go on to craft the identity. How we are received and perceived by the world, and the collection of our actions going forth into it, will be shaped by the conscious insofar as we will do all that we can to enact and behave in a manner that is congruent with what we believe about ourselves, i.e., the ego-self construct. If one seeks recognition or social validation as a primary motivation, then it can be said that the conscious stories are incongruent with those of the unconscious, and that the health of the individual is very likely suboptimal as a result. Along these very same lines, the unconscious and its narratives shape identity by means of influencing what one is drawn to or repulsed from. That is to say that the social contexts in which one abides frequently will work to mold the identity in their own unique ways. The unconscious narratives will, should they contain significant aspects of the self that have been forcibly repressed, shape the identity via the consequences of the inevitable, compensatory, and uncontrollable behaviors that are bent on bringing the repressed aspects back into the light. These compensatory and uncontrollable habits are aberrant and often very detrimental to the health of one's relationships. This is due to a lack of authenticity. The lack of authenticity that follows from repression can and will be felt by those with eyes to see and open hearts, this being our friends and kin. It is also possible, too, that feedback from such awakened kin would be quite confrontational, as it would run contrary to the ego self's conscious, self-constructed narratives. So how does the prophilic self slot into all of this, then? Well, this contrived and curated digital self will have the maker's mark of both the conscious and the unconscious mind. The domain of the prophilic self is so public in degree and in scope that no aspect of our neurophysiology or psychological ancestry, for that matter, is adequately prepared to reckon with it. As a result, the natural and compensatory compulsions used to address desire and need are supercharged from the vastness of the digital arena and the immediacy with which we can engage and receive feedback. Further still, prolific and frequent engagement with this digital realm will introduce new and false signifiers that stand to substitute for meaningful social enmeshment. Things like comments, follows, shares, and likes are now quickly replacing the meaning-rich moments of validating intimacy that were and are still supplied by authentic human relationships. This introduction is captivating, and intentionally so. We are well aware now that the most popular user interfaces are designed to capture and contain attention. There are major and very dire consequences to this, not least among them being the perpetual perceptual externalization of the source of meaning and value. This means we look outside ourselves to feel better. One direct result of this externalization is the habituated neglect of the unconscious and its integration. Yet another danger presents itself with the rise of the prophilic self, and this is the prolific and popularized conflation of the prophilic with the authentic self. This can be easily identified when we see those who center their ego's worth on their digital metrics of likes and follows. This mentality is often extended outwards to the judging of the value of others as well. Frustratingly accompanying such misplaced attributions of value and meaning are often mood disorders, including but not limited to anxiety, depression, body dysmorphia, and suicidal ideation. And that is to say nothing of the frequent or enduring feelings of emptiness, meaninglessness, a lack of purpose, and loneliness. This is an awful menu of experience that is far too common in today's day and age. It behooves us then to find a way out of such dead ends, and thus, to this end, I raise our next inquiry. What practices can help us bridge the gap between the authentic self and those facsimiles, either egoic or prophilic, that we act out in both the digital and physical spaces? For this section, I will take it as fact that when one lives more authentically as a result of integrating the unconscious, that the temptation presented by identifying with our prophilic self all but weakens to the point of irrelevance. The same can be said for the apparently compelling reasons we withhold our authenticity inside of all of our in-person relationships. Therefore, the goal of bridging the gap ought to be better understood as bridging the gap between the unconscious and the conscious rather than the authentic and the prophilic. So our question then becomes, what practices bridge the gap between the conscious and unconscious minds such that the temptations and pitfalls of the prophilic self become all but irrelevant? Awareness is always the first and most powerful step. Therefore, identifying where you have overemphasized the reality and relevance of your prophilic self is highly recommended. Questions like, what is your relationship to social media? What feelings do you soothe by scrolling? And what is the best case scenario when you post something? Are your posts meaningful and authentic to you, or are they curated to please your respective audience? Additionally, acknowledging the existence of a very real and very unknown part of you, that is the unconscious, is absolutely necessary. Further beyond that, one must also acknowledge that the unconscious is replete with meaning. It has much to tell, much to show, and it has needs and a vocabulary that you can and ought to come to know. In order to come to know anything, we must first acknowledge that we do not know something. Then, and only then, can information begin to flow into consciousness. This applies equally for coming to know the unconscious or other aspects of self. Thus, one practice that you can integrate is to play as though your unconscious is another person and to ask it questions relevant to your most emotionally potent experiences. To receive the answers, you can journal, as writing has a very special way of tapping into the deep internal sea. Secondly, I recommend you look at your dreams. If you recall, I noted that the unconscious speaks in the symbolic, the metaphoric, and the mythic. Well, consider your dream space the ideal canvas for the unconscious. Offering a question to your depths just prior to sleep can bring about remarkably clear results should you commit both to recording and interpreting that night's dream. So, if we set authenticity or living authentically as the aim, then cultivating the following skills will be necessary. First, and as mentioned, the interpretation of your dreams. Secondly, inward listening during conscious hours based in curiosity and humility. And thirdly, recognizing how your body responds to both truth and to inauthenticity. This last one is particularly and potently applicable. Your body and your conscience know when you speak or act out of alignment with what is most true and authentic for you. Note how you feel when you lie, when you self-abandon, people please, enact damaging coping strategies, etc. How do you feel when you do these things? By becoming acutely capable of identifying the sensations that arise when you act out these aforementioned habits, you will well be on your way to centering your life and your expressions in the real and the authentic, rather than the contrived or prophilic. The realms in which you are likely to notice the greatest change upon taking in these practices are the realms of your language, both internal and external, as well as in your decisions. Admittedly, what we say is said by choice, and thus our speech is considered to be a series of decisions, be they reactive, responsive, habituated, or intentional. So then, how does the language we use, be it ancient, modern, symbolic, or digitally derived, affect our capacity for individual and collective growth? To grow is to change, to release the old for the new and hopefully for the better. And although it is not necessary to know what you might grow into or how, it can be said with certainty that what you believe to be possible for yourself will shape your capacity to recognize the meaningful paths before you. You could not become a better version of yourself if you could not recognize both your ability to transform and the opportunity to do so. Our capacity to recognize or acknowledge either our potential future self and the choices given to us to get there are in large part shaped by the narratives, made up of language, that we hold in mind about the world and about ourselves. Therefore, literacy in language and its perception-shaping effects is necessary in order to avoid or undo self-imposed limitations on growth. Why are you so sure about who and what you could become? Where are you still blaming others and circumstances for the suffering that you've endured? Why is conviction so tempting a robe to wear when we know deep down we are ignorant of magnitudes more than we could ever fathom? What if you don't yet know who you could become? And what if it's up to you to steward the process of your evolution to its end, rather than picking a socially approved avatar to act out for the rest of your years? When we begin to withdraw from the linguistic environments that overemphasize the ego and prophilic selves, we have but one meaningful place to go. And in so going, we are beset with the necessity of confronting our mythical and metaphoric literacy. I am, of course, speaking of the unconscious, but allow me to emphasize exactly why literacy in the language of symbol, myth, and metaphor is so necessary. Imagine we commit to the notion that both the entirety of ourself and the meaning of our lives is within our individual domain to determine. If we accept this, then we have nowhere to go but down, as the limits of our rationality, our perception, and intellect will have been set to attain a goal far beyond their means to achieve. When, however, we allow ourselves to recognize the inseparable ensconcement of the totality of our meaning-making within the realm of symbol, myth, and metaphor, then doors of opportunity and understanding previously undetected by the intellect will present themselves with a regularity that rivals only our biological functions. Further, and with practice, these symbolic and mythic images will trickle down into the realm of language and then can imbibe our thoughts and beliefs with a perspective that is wholly more capable of meaning-making than our intellect could ever hope for. So by weaving these two realms of knowing, the emotive, ancestral, symbolic, mythic, and unconscious, with the conscious, rational, and intellectual, we serve to more successfully encompass the totality of our humanity. And in so doing, our stories and lives will improve as a result of their being saturated by the real. Connection, saturation, and communion with the real and the true. Why is this so pertinent and so damn crucial to the betterment of human life, and to that end, to the living one's greatest authenticity? Well, if you've read my book or listened to several episodes of this show, you'll know that I believe that truth is the source of all meaning and all value. Truth, value, and meaning might seem abstract at the moment, but they underpin every single moment of our perceptive human existence. Thus, there is a great impetus to orient towards their source, ever the more in such an upside-down and distorted culture as ours. So, what steps can we take to align and enliven our inner narratives and external expressions so as to more fully relate to truth, to value, and meaning? At the risk of sounding repetitive, awareness is the absolute first step we must take when working towards the goal of personal transformation. Awareness and honesty go hand in hand. Thus, getting really honest with yourself about the stories you are telling, both about yourself and the world at large, and maybe even recording them for familiarity, will be essential before you can hope to align and enliven these stories, and thus begin to more fully relate to truth, value, and meaning. The simplest way I know to start practicing this is the practice of noticing what your thoughts are saying. You might, as an opportunity, take a day and assume the role of the independent observer and simply watch, withhold judgment, and listen. What are you repeating to yourself and to others? Note this down. Truly, put your full focus to it, as once it enters the purview of the conscious mind, it will not be easily dismissed. Next, you might evaluate the credibility and the supportiveness of the more frequent thoughts that you discover by asking of them questions like, do I know this with certainty to be true? How do I know? How do I feel when I choose to believe this to be true? What kind of person do I become by believing and acting out this thought as true? Now, for the very astute among you, you might recognize these questions as stemming from the 4 questions of Byron Katie's work. The power in these questions is that they begin to dismantle falsehoods. But dismantling falsehoods is only half of the work. The other half is introducing resonant and authentic, truthful alternatives in their stead. But how on earth do we know with what to replace them? Well, exploring affirmations that resonate deeply is a powerful, viable option. However, there will be no greater source of resonant authenticity than your own being. And thus, we return to the necessity of integrating the unconscious and the shadow. For when these are integrated, there is more of you to know. What might you say if yours was the only opinion that mattered? How would you act and express yourself if you were the only person around? What parts of you are you most afraid to show the world? Each of these questions is capable of directing your attention to the threshold between conscious and unconscious, and this threshold can be understood as the font of authenticity. Life, aliveness, and being All are imbued with truth and value. When your authenticity rises into consciousness, it brings with it a vitality whose absence may not have been fully understood, but was likely always felt. The alignment, then, is towards truth and its source, such that we begin to draw the most real in us up from the well of unconscious into consciousness in the present moment. The enlivening comes when we allow these authentic and truthful realities to rise without condemnation and to take the courageous risks of expressing them out into the world. There is simultaneously a degree of complexity and an almost ridiculous simplicity to this process, such that can be felt in the all too common advice of just be yourself. If we don't know from where the multitude of facets of ourself arise, and we don't know what stance to take in order to bring them into wholeness, then such adages are practically meaningless. And so let us review where we have made our major touch points in today's investigation so as to offer something hopefully more meaningful than just be yourself. We began with an inquiring into the nature of the conscious and unconscious minds, into identity, and the prophilic self. We expanded this by explaining the various ways that these four psychological forces intersect and interact, and how ignorance to their nature produces a weakness that makes one more vulnerable to the kinds of temptation that perpetuate the modern miseries of anxiety, depression, and meaninglessness. I then did my best to present ways to overcome such weakness and vulnerability by illuminating what I consider to be accessible and actionable steps to come into greater connection with your authentic self. Building from this, I then proposed some methods by which these new and meaning-rich inner connections might grow into fruitful inner and outer habits of thought and language so as to promote your highest well-being. The hyperconnectivity of this world, combined with the ever-increasing distractions that pull our awareness outward, are a force with which our psyche is poorly prepared to contend. Add to that a culture that is nearly illiterate in myth, symbol, and metaphor, and you have the recipe for millions of souls with ancient cravings to be immersed in a social structure that is utterly ill-equipped to satiate. Now, it is my sincere wish that you benefited in some way from the content of this episode, and I'd like to take a moment to thank each of you who watch weekly, who listen across the various podcast platforms, who are leaving supportive comments and insightful questions. All of this is deeply encouraging, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you. And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have two invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.